Good morning, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Nyendo Mashua Munio. I currently lead the communications and engagement for the Agriculture for Food Security Program 2030, also known as AgriFoSe2030. I'm currently based in Nairobi, so it's morning for us. Thank you for joining. Thank you for keeping time. And welcome to the media engagement training webinar for researchers who are mostly involved in food systems and agriculture. So thank you for joining. We'll just do a quick poll. We'll put up a poll just for you to tell us where you're joining us from. Kindly remember that this meeting is being recorded. So if you have any objection to that, you can put off your camera or just let us know. But it will be used for other trainings in the future, and it will also be uploaded on YouTube. So there's a poll on your screen. If you could just put in the country that you're joining us from, that would be awesome. So the primary goal of this training is to equip researchers with necessary skills on how to effectively communicate their research findings and how to communicate to different audiences. So we have an array of speakers from around the world who will be taking us through different sessions. I hope you find this session interactive. It will be 3 hours, but in the middle of it, we'll have a health break, 5 minutes to stand, to stretch, to fill up our coffees. So don't worry about it. I hope there will be feedback sent after the webinar. You can tell us if the content was relevant, if the delivery was good. If there's demand, we can also hold a part 2 for the webinar. So this webinar is for researchers, as I said, and the assumption is that people are joining us with different knowledge levels. So you could be knowledgeable in media, it could be just starting off. So it's really for everyone across the board. So I could ask my colleague to start sharing the screen, the presentation, so that we can kick off the webinar. Thank you. So yes, so thank you for joining again. So today we're going to talk about the importance of communication for researchers, especially in agriculture and food systems. And I'll be running this session together with my colleague, Salom, who is a research fellow at the SIANI. We'll talk about SIANI in a short while. You can go to the next slide, Agnes. So we'll just talk a bit about AgriFoSe and SIANI. I'll start with AgriFoSe. Agriculture for Food Security 2030 is a program where we aim to synthesize and translate existing science into policy and practice. And we do this by building capacity for researchers on how to do this. So we have 3 ambitions that we've set out for ourselves, 3 outcomes. So one is to increase the capacity of scientists to synthesize, analyze, and communicate science with different stakeholders, to also improve the connection between science, policy, and practice. And we also aim to increase the use of science-based knowledge in policies and practices. So how do we do this? We aim to achieve those outcomes through strengthening research or institutional capacities in research translation. We also have projects what we call change projects that we work with the different institutions. We also have different courses that we run. You can check out our website, slu.se/AgriFoSe2030. The next slide should be about SIANI. SIANI stands for the Swedish International Agricultural Network Initiative. It's a global, open, and inclusive network that supports and promotes multisector dialogue and action around our vision for sustainable, right-based, and inclusive food systems. And SIANI seeks to contribute to change through knowledge management and communication, using amplification and awareness raising of marginalized perspective, inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogues that they hold among key stakeholders and representatives. They also do community building with different members and partners in their networks. SIANI has been in existence since 2008 and has over 4,500 members who are interested in sustainable agriculture, food security, and nutrition, particularly in low-income contexts. You can check out their website, siani.se. I think now we can go into the meat of the matter and start off with what we are actually here for. So why does communication matter? You can go to the next slide. Effective communication is crucial. I know researchers, there's a big, there's pressure points to publish, but I also advise that we also communicate the research findings with different stakeholders, different audiences, because the research findings that you you have, they have impact and relevance just beyond the academic circles. Communication is also important because it bridges the gap between research and real-world application. If you're doing research to actualize a change, then it needs to be communicated to other people for them to actually understand why the research was important to you and how it is relevant to their day-to-day lives. Communication also helps to disseminate knowledge, information, policy decisions, and drive innovation, especially in the agriculture and food systems. And the last point is that effective communication is important because it enhances public understanding, trust, and engagement with research. I wouldn't advise that we keep in our bubbles for researchers and the general public and policymakers. There has to be a thread that's connecting everyone. And how do we do this? It's through different communication. Next slide. So communications has different objectives. As I said, number one is stakeholder engagement. When you're doing your research, you need to bring other people on board. If it's the communities that you work in the region, it could be the municipal governments that in the areas that you work in, so that you can influence the policy. That's why we communicate. It also enhances the research impact and also brings together different partners on board so that you can effectively actualize the change that you're doing in your research work. Next slide. So there's different channels of communication, and one of the speakers will go in depth into this. I'm just giving a slight overview of what to expect. So you can use scientific journals, which I'm sure most researchers publish in. You can participate in conferences and workshops. You submit abstracts. You can write policy briefs that you then have to follow through, not just present it to the policymakers. You have to follow through with a bit of lobbying. You can use different government institutions, agencies, and non-governmental organizations. There's blogs, different social media, which we'll delve into today. There's also media. There's use of webinars and podcasts. You can also use other collaborative platforms as outlined there, and also through extension services. Next slide. So I'll hand over to my colleague Salom, who will take us through effective science communication for researchers. Welcome, Salom.
Thank you, Ngano. I'd like to discuss with you a little bit how to do effective science communication for researchers and why that is important, but also the challenges that researchers often face. Kindly move to the next slide. First of all, I'd like to let you know that there is confusion everywhere. You're not alone. Many of us write in very technical words, so we're not able to understand researchers in terms of what they would like to communicate. And many of you have read a scientific paper and thought to yourself, oh, I really don't understand anything here. It seems like several English words that have been put together, but they don't convey any meaning. Then you feel that you're tired or sleepy or dumb for some time, and that's why you don't understand it. But sometimes out of curiosity, you just check with your colleagues to find out whether they also understand the text, and you realize that you're all in the same boat. You all don't seem to understand the text. In my own experience, I've had to read some texts 6 times, sometimes one line 6 times, and I still don't get to understand what they're trying to communicate. And the picture on the image on the right just is a reminder of how I try to understand complex research texts. You put your leg in a bowl of warm water and try to stay awake and try to keep your brain active in trying to understand it. But it doesn't really help if the person who's written the text is not really communicating and is using several technical jargons. So you're not alone in terms of your inability perhaps to understand complex text. We have all experienced this, so we need to try to make it a little bit better for all of us to understand how to communicate. But in order, the reasons why we need to communicate better, I think there are a couple of them. Ngeno has already gone through some of them, but I'd like to highlight 3 of these. First, it helps us to address urgent issues. We all know about the COVID-19 pandemic that the world was plagued with recently. And if researchers were not able to communicate properly, we would not be able to understand what's going on and how to deal with it. The world is facing other complex challenges such as climate change and food security that needs the combined effort of the entire society to deal with. So we need science-based information to be widely available to the public in ways that they can be understood. And this also helps to reduce misinformation and increase public engagement on these critical issues. Number 2, good science communication also helps educate decision makers. And researchers have a duty to make sure that decision makers are informed with the latest science about critical socioeconomic issues. And this helps to ensure that evidence-based policies are made. There's a terrible example of how President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa denied the existence of HIV, basically in the mid 1990s and early 2000s. And that led to a terrible situation with South Africa having over 300,000 deaths from HIV, with devastating effect even to today. There's a phenomenon called AIDS orphans that is still going on in South Africa, but a lot has got to do with the latest science not being available to him, and him also basically denying the existence of a phenomenon such as HIV. So we can see how devastating the effect of denial by policymakers can be, and we researchers have to try to communicate as much as possible to them in clear ways so that they can understand and make the right policies. Finally, also, when we communicate well, we are able to get societal buy-in and continuous support for investment in scientific research. Many taxpayers rarely see what a scientific research budget line that they continuously pay for is useful, and they don't really see whether it supports value for money. So we need to make sure that we communicate and shine a spotlight on our research to showcase clearly how we're contributing to societal development. But I would like to share also with you why researchers struggle with communication. Next slide, please. Well, one of the first reasons why researchers struggle with communications is just simple fatigue and the grueling process of publication. You're doing your research and you have to do your research design, review the literature, collect data, conduct synthesis, address review comments. We all know about reviewers number 1, 2, and 3 that can give us a hard time before we publish the paper. So by the time we finish publishing, we are too tired. So we feel like, well, let's leave this communication work for others to do. And also have a certain ideology that communication gets in the way, perhaps, of the real work that we're supposed to do, which is research, but this is not very true. This sort of grueling process of publication is also influenced by the publish or perish culture that we have in academia, where peer review papers are the evidence that researchers need to provide in order to keep being employed. Nobody really is asking you, okay, where's this popular science article that you've written, etc. So we get into this sort of spiral of publishing and then going on to the next publication, etc., without finding time really to communicate. Number 2, the focus of many scientific publications has been to reach an expert audience, so researchers speaking to each other rather than speaking to the entire community. For a recent paper that I submitted to one of the highest journals in agriculture sciences, the editor requested a meeting with me, and some of what she said was that I should assume that the audience of the journal know the basics. So what new information can be provided? Yes, that works in a scientific publication where you're speaking to experts, but it doesn't really work when you need to communicate science. You can't take for granted that people already know certain things and that you don't go to the basics and explain. Number 3, nobody really teaches researchers how to communicate properly. We simply assume that they know how to do it, but a lot of researchers are winging it, using trial and error methodologies in order to communicate. So we often fall into the wrong examples or the trap of following what we see other researchers doing, which might not be the right thing to do. It's also the case that many researchers prefer technical words and jargons of the research discipline instead of using simpler words that might convey the same meaning. So there's a certain language that you need to speak as a researcher in order to show that you're an expert in your discipline. But many of the public that we wish to communicate to do not even understand these. So political economy scholars are very interested in words like proletariat, which is basically the working class, bourgeoisie, which is the landlord or business owners, in everyday language. So if you're so attached to these technical jargons, that you will not be communicating in the right way, and many people will not understand. But the reason why researchers maybe are stuck with the jargons is because they want to avoid the risk of oversimplification. That is that they feel that, well, if you say it in the simplest way, that you might be distorting facts. So there's a dilemma of accuracy for the researcher as using the right word or the right jargon versus effective communication. And sometimes we need to put on the hat of effective communication in order to communicate properly. Also, we might fall into this sort of trap of sensationalism, also tied to this oversimplification. Many researchers feel that, well, if we communicate the research in a way that the public is able to understand, then we're simply sensationalizing the issue, just trying to generate a better headline in order to reach readers, rather than getting to the heart of the issue. And that's why they are not able to communicate as effectively as they should. Then also many researchers are inspired by the Greek philosopher, for example, Socrates' mantra, who said that all I know is that I know nothing, and Isaac Newton's saying that the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. We feel like we don't know enough to say something about a certain phenomenon, maybe in a definitive way or communicating to the public as such. And this especially is common among social science researchers who are not able to make very objective conclusions of their research. So there's a little bit of not being sure, or in some senses, humility that comes with being a researcher. And so that prevents us from being able to communicate effectively. Next slide, please. But generally, scientists are speaking and we can't seem to understand them. There are 5 million research papers that are published per year, but a lot of them are not published perhaps at the right time, or do not ride the wave of things that are gaining attention today. We also don't use simple words in our communication or in our research. So we tend to use a lot of compound and multi-syllable words. We have agro-industrial, quasi-governmental, nature positive, agroecology, and all these technical things. And we also are very interested in adding prefixes and suffixes to many words to make them sound maybe a lot more intellectual. So capital becomes capitalism, impoverished becomes impoverishment, colonial becomes post-colonial, ethnic becomes ethnocentrism, etc. So what are researchers saying and how are they saying them? This is an example for you to see. Next. So there are technical and jargon reading words. For example, a sentence reads, capitalist accumulation is likely to increase impoverishment and ethnocentrism, which is strongly linked to post-colonialism. The activities of the erstwhile Belgian state gives a picturesque illustration of how intersectionality based on gender and ethnicity leads to increased discrimination and stratification of hitherto uniform societies. It's such a mouthful, and you're tired by the time you finish reading the sentence. And as a reader, you might have to read it several times in order to understand it. But we can say this in a much simpler and clearer way. For example, increases in capital accumulation by one group is likely to impoverish others, especially those who belong to ethnic groups that are not favored by colonial governments. The activities of the colonial Belgian state paints a vivid picture of how the intersection between a person's ethnic group and their gender can lead to increased discrimination. Even today, remnants of these colonial activities continue to stratify previously uniform societies. It's a bit wordy, but it's okay as long as readers can understand you. Next slide. So when we communicate effectively, then we are able to reach high impact. There's a recent research article that was published by a colleague of mine in Lund University, and the article focuses on machine learning and satellite imagery for poverty prediction and what the implications of these are on development research. It has 3,000 reads and 12 citations since February 2023, which is about a year. But then they wrote a popular science opinion about this, which was titled How AI Sees the World. What happened when we trained a deep learning model to identify poverty? And with that, they got 60,000 reads since November to 2023, which is just about 3-4 months from now. and also had a snowball effect, which is that the sort of article was picked up by 3 other news outlets. So you see the difference in the sort of traditional journal publication and what attention you get, and how much attention you get if actually you convey your research in a much simpler way and communicate to a wider audience. Please, next slide. Next slide. Okay. Another advantage of communicating our research is that we're able to elicit responses from the policymakers and encourage action. So this is an example also from the conversation on a paper titled Unintended Genomic Outcomes in Current and Next Generation GM Techniques, a systematic review. And then the popular science opinion reads, genetically modified crops aren't a solution to climate change, despite what the biotech industry says. So this generated a response from the American Seed Society, who said that plant breeders need all the tools at their disposal to provide improved plant varieties to farmers so they can continue producing in a challenging environment. And this simply is that plant breeding will be as important as genome editing in developing improved plant species capable of withstanding climate change. And then this sort of article was also sent to large GM seed providers such as Bayer and Corvetta for comment as well. So you see that you're able to reach more of the practitioners and the policy audience if you communicate your research in simpler ways, or you convert it into a popular science article. Next slide, please. As researchers, it is important that we communicate to the right audience. We need to be able to ensure that we are communicating to the right people who can understand what we are saying and can take action with regards to what we're saying. So it's important to ask ourselves whether this group that we're communicating to is able to understand and make use of the research. Then, in order to do that, you need to ask whether the group needs general knowledge of a phenomenon, whether they need policy advice, or whether they need to make strategic changes in their business, etc., so that you are able to give the right message to the right group. And when you know your audience, you'll be able to choose a matching angle to your article. Sometimes the article's most interesting aspects for the public and private sector and policymakers are not the aspects that are not most academically interesting. So it's good to focus on what is new or unusual, highlight what is important, but insufficiently discuss and summarize a complex field of inquiry as researchers. Next slide, please. And there's the issue of voice and narrative, how to go about communicating your research. And researchers often use a dehumanized passive voice in their communication, and other speakers after me will talk about this. But it's important, for example, for you to keep the active voice in your research. And also that your research should focus on, maybe some research often focuses on providing hard facts in terms of the journal article that you're publishing, etc. But in terms of science communication, you want to excite people. You want to get people interested in a phenomenon. You want to entertain them a little bit as well. So there are two different ways of looking at it. One being that hardcore scientific research tries to just communicate what is true and what is objective, and the other science communication tries to bring out the sort of very interesting aspects of the research to the public. It's important that you tell a compelling story that sucks the researcher in and leaves them wanting more. Each sentence that you have in your sort of popular science article needs to be curated and it needs to be properly curated so that it's part of the narrative. When you do that, you are able to base the readers into developing genuine research into the genuine interest into the research. You take the researchers or the readers on a journey and paint a graphic picture of the phenomenon you're trying to describe. And also you can use concrete examples as much as possible. Next slide for an example. So this is not perhaps the way that most people do it, but I try to take inspiration from my favorite novelist, and that would be Chinua Achebe in this case. And here's an example of a text that he wrote. And this is a way of perhaps sucking, people into your popular science article and getting them to develop interest in it. So it's a story of Okoye, the creditor, and Unoka, the debtor, and things fall apart. And it says Okoye was a great talker and skirted around the subject for a long time before hitting it finally. In short, he was asking Unoka to return the 200 cowries he had borrowed from him more than 2 years ago. As soon as Unoka understood what his friend was driving at, he burst out laughing with tears in his eyes. His visitor was amazed and sat speechless. At the end, Unoka was able to give an answer between fresh bursts of laughter. "Look at that wall," he said, pointing at the far wall of his hut, which was rubbed with red earth and so that it shone. "Look at those lines of chalk," and Unoka saw groups of short perpendicular lines drawn in chalk. There were 5 groups, and the smallest group had 10 lines. Each group, 3, they represent a debt to someone, and each stroke is 100 cowries. You see, I owe that man 1,000 cowries, but he has not come to wake me up in the morning for it. I shall repay you, but not today. I shall repay my big debts first. And he took another pinch of snuff, as if that was paying off the debts first. Disappointed with the response, Okoye rolled his goat skin and departed. This is not a popular science test, but it helps you to learn, for example, from the use of simple words, from the use of graphic descriptions. You feel like you're a witness of the interactions that's going on. You also see that the active voice is being used there. I shall pay you, but not today. I shall pay my big debts first. These are the active voice that is being used by Chinua Achebe here. And you see also an element of surprise, literally communicating that don't come asking me for your money today. And also notice how the author builds up the story as well. It leaves readers wanting more. Next slide, please. Another thing that you should take note of is that it's important to have a catchy hook, and I think my colleagues will also speak a little bit about this. But a hook is simply a paragraph that piques interest in a certain topic or a phenomenon that you wish to discuss. So it's a first paragraph that actually gets readers to have interest in what you wish to communicate. And here we have an example of an article titled "Breaking Barriers: Economic Skills Training Shatters Patriarchy and Levels the Playing Ground for Women." And you see that the first paragraph really talks about how training of Uganda's female farmers in hygienic milk production actually adds value and actually leads to value addition and helps to improve their power in making decisions in the household. I'm running out of time, so I'll move on. Next slide. So in order for you to attain high impact, I think it's important for you to be creative, try to use visual storytelling if you can. Aim to reach high impact and strategic news outlets. Yes, you can write a blog, an article for The Economist, The Washington Post, the BBC, and there you can also benefit from the snowball effect of reaching other news outlets. Consider the national and global news cycle and try to write an opinion or repost and drive traffic to your previous opinions that you've written. One of the highest viewed posts on my organization, SEI's website, is about 10 years old and is still gaining publicity. You have done all the work and now you have moved on to other things. Sometimes you're interested in a new research area, but it's good to keep an eye on what is going on and what you can pick up from your previous research, which may be relevant today. And this is mainly because a lot of researchers are conducting groundbreaking research into new areas that the public perhaps have not yet caught on. So when you've moved away from it after 3 or 4 years, that's when the public catches on. It's good to pick back some of that conversation and discuss it and not totally discard it because you've moved on to a new thing. Next slide. Quickly, here are a few takeaways. We need to remind ourselves of who the audience is and who we are really communicating to. We need to time our research properly and learn to ride the high waves, what's in the news cycle. We need to seek opportunities to communicate as much as possible and to communicate in different ways. So that means a lot of practice, not just hardcore writing of articles, but communicating in very simple everyday language. And we need to ask ourselves who the audience is, what they wish to hear, and how we can reach them. Finally, your enthusiasm for your subject is why you research it. So let that enthusiasm shine through in your work. I'd like to leave you with a final quote from Carl Sagan in the book titled A Demon Hunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. He says, keep it simple. Don't talk to the journal audience as you would talk to your scientific colleagues. There are terms that convey your meaning instantly and accurately to fellow experts. You may use these phrases every day in your professional work, but they do no more than mystify an audience of non-specialists. Use the simplest possible language. Above all, remember how it was before you yourself grasp whatever it is you are explaining. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salom. That's a very interesting presentation from Salom, who's a researcher who recently transitioned into communications. So he's speaking from experience. So thank you so much for setting the scene for us. Now we'll dive straight into Ulrika Lambert's presentation. Ulrika is joining us from the Stockholm Environment Institute, where she works as a senior press officer, and she'll be taking us through practical communication skills, specifically techniques for successful media interviews and public speaking. So over to you, Ulrika.
Thank you very much. I will start by trying to share my screen and hope we are successful with this tech stuff. And I'll just change to so do you see it well now?
Yes, can see your screen. Thanks.
Good. Okay, I am having two screens, so I will bend my head a little bit, but thank you very much for having me today. I'm very happy to be here. And during the coming 30 minutes, we will do some, I will teach you some tips and tricks on how to survive an interview, basically, and also to see the great advantages, which Salom already had touched, of getting your research out into mainstream media as well, and then out to the public. I will start by sharing a few slides where the other presenters probably will deep dive than I do. But to me, it's really important when you work with media and doing media work that you understand what is newsworthy and also respect and understand the world of the journalists. That is kind of key to your success to get out there and also when doing an interview. So basically, it's good to understand or to remember that what actually makes a story newsworthy, because anything can be news, but not everything is newsworthy. How a story is told is kind of sometimes even more important to the audience than its topic. What's it about? Because if they don't understand what you're saying, as Salom just said, they will not listen. So the best stories which you read or hear in the media, they are the ones the reader feels is relevant and significant to some extent to them. And to decide if a story is newsworthy, journalists evaluate what is happening by checking against a variety of criteria. They're doing some, what we would call a news evaluation. So to make a story newsworthy, I tend to say that you should think of making a really tasty soup. You need several ingredients. And to make it really short, because this section could actually be 30 minutes by its own, is that what are these ingredients in the tasty news soup? There are several, and I've only picked a few here, but very basically, news are often something that is unexpected, surprising. It can involve a conflict, it can present new results. A very old but classic example is if I say to you that a dog bit a man, that will not be news, just for that specific dog and man. But if you say that a man bit a dog, that will make it a little bit more interesting and newsworthy. When you have something that's news, it's important that it's timely. So that's why it's important to have this outward-looking eye when doing your research and see what our society discussing. Can the research I do attach to that, those happenings in society? Proximity is also a very important factor. It can be something that occurs geographically, temporarily, or culturally close to the reader, listener. That means basically me, I'm living in Sweden. I'm very interested in news happening in Sweden, but also in the outer world, of course. But the more near to me the news are, often they get more interesting. but it can also be if Swedish people are abroad and something happens, like a huge catastrophe or something where Swedish people are involved, the Swedish news media, they will most probably turn their eyes and report from that spot, even though it might be geographically very long away. It can also be that the news are about something that you feel culturally connected to. And these things are kind of important to keep in mind when you want to get your research out there. It's also important to have this human interest and personalization angle, that what in your research can be interesting for the common public, for people out there. What results are you presenting and what are the solutions? That will make it more easy for them to connect to what you are saying. If you have a lot of data when you're doing research, you can also normally have good statistics, you can make great visuals and add on to the communication of your research. And that can also be used when then going into an interview situation. You can use that to illustrate to the journalists and make it more understandable what your research are actually showing. So normally you could say that the more of these criteria that a story fulfills, the more likely it is to make the news. However, we live in a global world with a huge amount of stories coming out every day. So even though you might have something that is really newsworthy, you might as well be outcompeted by others. Then you shouldn't give up. There might be other opportunities, but sometimes one has to accept that the story just is dropped and the world will move on anyway. So this as well, Salon touched a bit on, but this could also be used when starting to thinking of getting your research out there and doing interviews. You have to take your research from research, the research language, to a compelling story, like find and use and touch to the criteria I just mentioned. So take a step back, read your text, read your conclusions and think, okay, what is new here? Is there anything surprising and unexpected? And you can as well, you can test on people around us, preferably not research college. You should instead turn to the comms people, if you have a communication organization, or you can test at family and friends. That might be like a little small test of the general public. You should also ask yourself, why is this important now? Why would media like to interview me and talk about this now? And it might be that you find out, well, actually, it might be better in a couple of months' time when we have this huge event like COP or huge conference or other people presenting stuff where you can hang on to with your research. You should also ask yourself the bit hard question maybe is, why should anyone care about these results? And that's because it's kind of important to get people engaged, create some feelings when you communicate in order to get their attention. Quite often you present results, your research shows something, and you might have solutions that you think are the good ones to solve this problem. But you also need to think about when communicating outside, who should do these solutions, who should make it happen? Because these people will be your target audience. If it is politicians, you might be want to turn your attention to media outlets where the important policy makers or decision makers of this specific topic are, where they are the target audience. So before now going into the interview situation, I would like to do a little bit 3 points. That remember that it is a difference between writing for an academic audience and writing for the media, for politicians and the public. They have other words. They do not understand everything you're saying with your scientific language. But well, very often I meet people saying, when I train them for an interview, saying, well, I can't make it that simple. It will not be the same, but I promise you it will, because simplifying and adjusting to the target audience doesn't make the message less correct or valid. It just makes it easier for people to understand. They do not have to have all the details. And speaking to all these different audience, which you can meet when talking to all these different media outlets, is an art, and an art to master. So you need training, and that's why I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks. But let's start with a moment when media wants an interview. What shall you do then? Well, first of all, my main recommendation is always take the call or answer the email when media reaches out. Because even if a journalist calls you at the most stressful time, it is my very strong recommendation to take the call, because doing interviews is part of building relations with media, and it's an essential part. And those relationships which you will build up when doing a lot of interviews can be of great value when the time comes where you have something that you really want to get out there. If you have good connections, or you work with a press officer or communication people who have good media connections, this is crucial. If you say no every time media reaches out, they will stop reaching out. When talking to the journalist, you can always ask about the topic and what they want answers to. You can ask for the questions, but you should never count on that you can have all the questions. But you can get a hint, or you can get a summary of basically, this is what I want to know. Then when doing the interview, new questions might arise, and I will show you why a bit later in this presentation. You should also ask yourself before continuing if you are the person to talk to. It might be that it is not your topic, but it might be your colleagues, or it might be a researcher at another organization. Then please help the journalist to find the right person. That's also part of building relations. You can also ask for the angle and what context the interview should be published. And here you shall remember that you can ask, but the journalist is not obliged to answer. They will just share as much information with you as they think is necessary. And that is kind of the rules, and you should respect that. But most often you will get a hint, well, I will do this kind of my story. But you can't question the angle or the way they want to do the story, just to basically make it easy for you to give the journalist the right information and giving the best answers possible. Even though if you might be the person then to talk to, I would suggest that you just don't start the interview immediately. Sometimes they are on a very tough deadline. They want to publish in a few hours. Then still you can ask for like 15-30 minutes just to take some time to reflect, think about the questions you probably will have, and prepare a bit of answers. So you can always ask if you can come back after half an hour. And if you do that, it's extremely important that you do so. You have to respect the time you have given to the journalists. And sometimes there are, of course, stories which are prepared long in advance, which means that you can do the interview another day. You might have more time to prepare and so on. So there's kind of a difference. And sometimes you're doing maybe a TV interview, or there will be an article with a lot of pictures. Then it might be good to discuss a bit with the journalist where you want to meet, if there are a location which might frame the interview in a good way, and your message as well. So that can always be discussed with the journalist. So then you get into preparing the interview. I hope that most of you have the possibility to work with a communications officer or a press officer. Please talk to them before you do an interview. If you're very experienced and have done a lot of interviews, that might not be necessary, but it's always good to inform them. And they can most often help you digging out a bit what Salome talked about, what the newsy part of your research is. And when doing this, you could basically start from the basic journalist questions, which is what, where, when, who, how, and why. So it could, for example, be what has happened, what does your result say, where is this relevant, for example, when is this relevant, or when is something happening, which can connect to the research, who is this relevant for, and how did you come to these results, and why is it important for the society, for the people in this region, for example. Because if you answer these basic questions, you will get like a mini story of what your research shows. You should not do like you might do when you write the report, when you start with acknowledgement and the theory, and then you have the solutions and the results in the back of the report. As a journalist, when I worked as that, I always started with the results, the solutions, and the conclusions, and the abstract to get an overview. And then I can dig into the report to find the really nice details. You should also, it might be that you have done research maybe a couple of years ago, and for some reason it pops up again. Then it might be a good thing to check a bit about the facts and the messages you had when you communicated the report the last time, to see if there is some data or some facts which might need to be updated a bit, if possible, or alert a journalist that, well, this research was made a few years ago, so there might have been things that changed. That is a good way to show that you are up to date and trying to give the journalist good and new information. Also, in preparation before starting, when you have done this basic work of answering the basic journalistic questions, you need to prioritize. You cannot tell the journalist in the media, in the interview, everything you have found out, even though it might be super interesting. You have to prioritize and choose what you think is the most important message from the research, from the result that you have. You can then formulate a few like sub-messages, but they should connect to your main message. And when doing this, again, take a step back and look at your research from the outside and in, not inside out. Because you have been working probably for a couple of years with your research. It's like being in a little box. You know everything, you know all the details, but those who are going to, the journalists who will talk to you now, and the people who will read the story, they will not know that. So you have to help them by picking out the cherries in the cake, and also adapt your language when doing the interview. And when you do it, you can use facts, figures, statistics, which support your message and also explain it. I kind of often recommend that you can use a metaphor to explain complicated scientific words or facts to make it easier for the audience to understand what you mean. And when you do this, you know that you have found a good message, and you can test it on your computer, for example, is when you have something you want to, when the message kind of contains what you want to convey and what the audience wants to know. You can also, as we have spoken a bit, or I have spoken a bit on solutions, try to formulate answers to questions like, what is the problem, which is the solution, and how can your research contribute to the solution? And then actually every now and then, it might be a good thing, just practice talking about your research in a clear and simple way. Try to find words and get more used to talking in like a non-scientific language. Here are some examples. I will do this very quick because we will soon have a little exercise. Examples of key messages. And what you can see, why I've highlighted in yellow here, is like fact and figures which might draw attention. You have something here which might increase food security for over 2 billion people. That's a lot of people. That makes this interesting. And it also is connected to a huge amount of money. That's also a fact that draws the eye to the message. And the same with the second one on the right. about food insecurity, how many people are food insecure, how many people are affected by hunger and malnutrition, and who are they? Here you give the journalist a lot of interesting information which he or she can use when building a story. Another way to do it is, here are examples from first the production gap report, and the other one is from a report from Oxfam, where I provide the data, where you can see when you use, like, you have condensed the huge reports to very short and snappy messages, which people tend to understand. And both of these messages I have seen repeated in several media outlets which had covered these important topics. So it's worthwhile putting some effort in creating these short and snappy messages. Here I will keep it really simple, because this could also be a bit of a jungle. But it might be that you come in the situation where you have here the phrases on the record and off the record. I guess that most of you will mostly never meet off the record, only on the record. But just to say a few words. On the record means that everything that you say in the conversation with the journalist can be used and attributed to you and your title. And that is like the main point also with doing the interview. Sometimes you hear off the record. That means that you give information to journalists which is not intended for publication. It's kind of used to give the journalist more context, some background to the story. Some reporters might use this if another source can confirm it. But what's important here to remember is that it's basically, you have to agree with the journalist before the interview starts if you want to do anything off the record. So if you're new to doing interviews, just keep it simple and just assume that everything you say is on the record and you can be quoted, and that's actually also what you want to do. So when you do the interview, you should see the interview as an opportunity to get your message across. You will be a bit nervous, but it will be fun and it will be worthwhile doing it. Because you should remember, what you have is that you know something that the reporter doesn't. I think I mentioned before that a lot of journalists today, they are generalists. They don't know very much of each specific topic. They also work during very tough deadlines, and they have to deliver stories very fast sometimes. So you can actually help the reporter by doing the interview. Remember, especially if you're doing a radio or TV interview, to say the most important things first. You can always, everything you say can always be cut. When you quote it in print media or online media, you will almost never see the whole full quote which you've said. They will condense it a bit. It will still be the same message, but you should be aware of that will happen. If you have something that you really want to get out there, try to repeat it during the interview, but do not sound like a parrot and repeat the same thing a lot of times. But you can try to weave it into the story. And you shall always answer the question. I have one more slide where I will go a little bit more into this before we'll go to the practice. The other things here I think we've spoken about. There are a few points. Never lie, do not speculate, keep calm, and do not be provoked. This is if you will come into a situation where you have research which is a bit more controversial. You might get very critical questions, and then you should understand that that is the job of the journalist to ask you, to pose you these questions. Then you should not be provoked, or just explain calmly what your research shows, why you think it's important to provide the solutions you do. You should never get in an argument or be angry in an interview. Just respect the interview situation. And then remember that the interview will not be over until you and the reporter has parted ways. So everything you say until you parted ways can be used in the interview. So I said that you should always answer the question. That doesn't mean that you need to be question driven. Some questions are very direct, and you can just answer them, like, what are the most important conclusions from your study? Well, then you can just go ahead and answer. But quite often you can get questions which are like aimed to confirm a thesis or an angle the reporter have. And you can use this technique of bridging over to your message and still answer the question, but you can also get your message in. So you can consent, bend, and bridge. And then you can use there are several bridges technique we can use. You can speak in three, say, yes, this is a very good question, but first I want to say this, second this, and third this. Or on the other hand, our research shows is another way to do it. You can also use words like, in this context, I would also like to add, and I will be happy to answer your question, but first I want to say, so then you have, and then if you say something that is kind of more interesting to the journalist than the original question, you will have the possibility to elaborate. But you can also be coming back to the first question. But you should not avoid question, because I think that's basically very rude. But do not be too question driven. Do remember what you want to say. And finally, you have done the interview. Then you can do a few things. Here it is different. I know speaking to a global audience, so it might be different in different countries, different cultures, but you can often ask if you can check your quotes. Remember that you can't take anything back which you have said, but you can check that you have not been misunderstood, and if there are some facts that needs to be corrected, if it's been some kind of misunderstanding. But you cannot and should never ask journalists to change the angle or the headline or the way they are writing, because it's their job, their story. But you can, as said, check your quotes and so on. And if they'd reach out to you and ask for follow-up questions, please take them. That's also another option to get your message out and also to keep a good relation with the journalist. Then do spread the article in social media. Credit the media outlet, credit the journalist, and be proud of yourself. And remember, now you've done the interview and you can actually do it. If something goes wrong, I have 4 small points. If it's not perfect according to yourself, it's probably good enough and very good. If you're wrongly quoted, please talk to your communications officer or your press officer, and they will help you to judge what to do. Because sometimes it's a huge factual mistake, well, then it needs to be corrected. Sometimes it's just some tiny, whiny detail important to you, but not to the world. Then just leave it be. And remember, tomorrow is another day. There will be new chances and new opportunities to do interviews. And now, I have been talking non-stop for a very long time. Now we'll do a very short interview. And I'm very happy to, and maybe in gender you'll talk as well, to introduce Dr. Judith Nagasha, who will now be interviewed by me, just showing and reflecting a bit on how to make an interview. And I think I can stop sharing them, right?
Yes, you can. Judith, if you could just turn on your camera and your microphone so that we can all have a view of. Okay, Ulrika, I think you can go ahead. Judith is on the call. Her camera is on. Yeah.
Yes. Have I stopped sharing? Because it seems now. Now it's stopped. Okay, yes. Great. Hi, Judith. Very happy to meet you.
Hi,
and to make this a bit more realistic, then I will turn on my glasses to look like a totally different person.
Will I survive this?
Yeah. And what we're going to do now is a very short live interview. It will be for TV or radio. I think we can imagine TV, as we have a huge audience watching us right now. And I would like to take Judith back, Judith and the audience back a little bit more, well, like a year ago, to June 2023. And at that point, Judith had won, and her project won an award, the Social Entrepreneurship Challenge. So this interview will be very shortly about this award and a bit about your research. And I shall now say to the audience that Judith is totally unprepared for this, and we'll see. I'm pretty sure it will be fine. So welcome to this morning show, Dr. Judith Nagasha. Did I pronounce your name right? Thank you. Good. Judith, you are from the Kiwambaga University, and recently one of your research projects, Gender and Livestock Value Change in Western Uganda, won the Social Entrepreneurship Challenge. Why did the project win this award?
Yeah, it was mainly impacting on the communities, especially empowering women in terms of value addition, and yet milk as a resource was the main resource in that community. So it was the people voting. I had to pitch up my project, and then the entire world had to vote. Why? Competition of very many projects. So people should tell me why they voted me. Yeah, thank you.
Can you tell me a bit more about the project per se?
Sorry?
Can you tell me a little bit more about the project? What did you do to come to the result?
Yeah, this project was in a highly patriarchal society. That's where the project area was. And the women had no much say in terms of access to resources and also ownership of resources. And yet, traditionally, they're the only people who can do value addition in that community. So it was, I mean, they had to do it. So I had to come in and do kind of capacity building to tell the male counterparts to change their mindset, because I mean, when the two of them are working together, they can be increased or improved livelihoods in the household. So it was, they were a bit hesitant, but due to continuous trainings and also support from AgriFoSe2030 project that trained us to use theory of change. I think to me, theory of change did wonders in that community for women empowerment. Yeah.
What is the theory of change?
Theory of change, it is an approach used by projects, by researchers, where you articulate change with the community themselves. So it involves different stakeholders. You do carry out a stakeholder analysis, and then you come together and articulate change for that particular community together with the communities and all the stakeholders involved, yes.
I'm also a bit curious, did we have any main challenges in the project? Like, did you mention that you wanted to empower women?
Yes.
Did all men or the livestock farms, did they welcome this project?
Yes, no, of course, at first, since all resources are owned by men in this community. So the first step was, the first particular training I did was to involve, I was targeting women, but I could not access women without their male counterparts. So the only approach was to invite couples for this training, for the kind of reconnaissance, telling them about what the project is all about and who are the beneficiaries and how the entire household will benefit, much as the entry point would be women, but the entire household will benefit from this entire community. Yeah, of course, some of the households refused, and so I had to move the households that accepted, not all of them. But later on, there was kind of regret why I wish we had also joined, because they saw the impact on ground.
Thank you. What were the reactions from the women who then finally participated? How are they perceived the project?
They had their indigenous system of doing things, but of course, with the quality was not good. Then the procedure they were using, the rudimentary tools, very tiresome. So what the main change story or phrase in that is that I gave them a chance to first showcase what they do. I didn't want to just brush it off, and then I said that we can advance this to a different level. And one of the main change story was getting these women from their communities to the city, about 350 kilometers to Kampala town. So they get proper training for you from Uganda Industrial Research Institute. So I had to write consent letters to the male counterparts, accept, release these women to come. And when they came, I made sure, because I mean, there's a lot of protection, security on them when they're in the community. So releasing them, I was also under pressure. I made sure that there was health, safety, everything was safe. Whenever they go to the training, I come back with them, have dinner with them, and then they express themselves like, oh wow, we are also out of this household now. We can be on our own in terms of training and all that. So to me that, and then when they got this other, I think they touched the unknown. I mean, how things work, how machines work, how the training was totally different from what they had. So they built theirs. I mean, I think their self-esteem went high. They said they can do it. And they went back and informed their male counterparts. And actually some of them put up a facility center for them. I mean, a production center for them because of the training they had received. And then those male counterparts were capable to put up a training facility center or production center for them. Yes.
Thank you very much. A final question, and then I will release you from this interview.
Yes.
In what way, very shortly, how does this project improve food security? Sorry? How does this project improve food security?
This particular area is along the cattle corridors of Uganda, where climate change impacts the area very badly. So during the wet seasons, there's plenty of milk wasted. So, and then when it comes to the dry seasons, it is not there. People go hungry, people get one meal a day and all that. So when you do value addition, when it is plenty, that the money that you get through that, they can help you survive during the long dry spells, where you can purchase other cereals that can cover up the milk production and all that. So it is one way where there's improvement in food security in this area, because the households, they may not have food, but they have the cash to go and purchase cereals, other foods from different communities. Yes.
Thank you very much, Judith, for doing this totally unprepared. Nintendo, do I have like 1 minute for feedback?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. Okay. Since this was an unprepared interview, I must say I'm impressed by Judith, that she managed to take on all the questions. I especially liked when you talked about the women, when you talked about they touch the unknown. That was some kind of key message. I would have lifted that up if I had written a story about this. Some of the answers were a bit long, but since this was totally unprepared, and you didn't know what you were going into, I'm pretty sure that if I had said before that you should prepare for a TV interview, you would have made it a bit shorter. I also think you managed to get your key message through to empower women, milk as a resource, and also how this can improve food security. So there would be some small things to work on, but I think you did very well. And thank you for doing this unprepared.
Thank you.
And I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrika. Thank you, Judith, for that mock interview. I hope we are learning as we go along with that practical lesson. So thank you again. Thank you. Okay, so we move on to the next speaker, and just a quick reminder for the participants who are joining us. If you click at the bottom of your screen, if you click on poll and quizzes, if you've not filled in where you're joining us from, kindly click on it and fill in the country you're joining us from. And also we'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, but feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you click on Q&A, you can put in the questions and the speakers will answer them at the end of the webinar. So now we move on to our next speaker, who is Thin Lei Win, who's joining us as a freelance journalist specializing in food and climate issues. And she'll be taking us through how to craft compelling content. Over to you, Thin.
Great. Thank you so much, Nando. You can hear me fine, right? Just to check?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, and Agnes for the slide as well. So just let me briefly introduce myself. Like Megan said, I am a journalist focusing specifically on this intersection between food systems and climate change. I've been a journalist for about 20 years or so now, including more than a dozen years with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the non-profit arm of the Reuters news agency. I started out first as a regional correspondent in Southeast Asia, and then I became an international correspondent looking specifically at food security and then food systems. I've left that job a little bit over 3 years ago and have been freelancing. But now these days, I spend most of my time doing two big things. As a lead reporter for the Food Systems Newsroom for Lighthouse Reports, which is an investigative non-profit newsroom that focuses specifically on investigations that are of public interest. And we're very much interested in food systems because we think this is the next frontier when it comes to climate action. And there's so much lack of understanding, I think, around food systems, the climate. This is something we come into contact with every single day, right? I mean, we can go without mobile phones or cars. We can do without flying if we want to, but food, we can't afford not to eat it. And so I think it's so important to understand the food security aspect, the malnutrition aspect, but also the whole value chain, the whole system perspective. So that's what we try and do. And that's also why, your role as researchers and scientists looking into food security and food systems issue is so, so important, because I think a lot of us take food for granted and where food comes from granted, particularly if you are living in the developed world. And we need to make sure that, ordinary people as well as journalists understand these linkages and why we need to, have better, more transformative food systems that are fairer, greener, and healthier. I also have my own newsletter called Thinning. That's why my name says Lighthouse Reports and Thinning. So, I've had a lot of experience in having to read scientific papers and research papers and to interview scientists, especially over the past decade, looking at, research on food systems, food security, climate impacts. And I just did a very brief sort of unscientific thing last week. I looked at how many press releases, newsletters, and offers for interviews and that I'd received over the past week. And I try to count, through my emails. And I have multiple email accounts because of the freelance work and also the Lighthouse work. But just in one email account, I got a total of 157 emails that were press releases, that were newsletters from organizations that are working on these issues, and press, I guess, PR companies offering me interviews and op-eds for people to speak to. So that's a little bit over, if you think of a working week as 5 days, that's over 30 emails a day. And that's in addition to all the other work emails I have to do. So that's a pretty typical week. And it can feel a bit overwhelming for a journalist when you get that. And when I say 157, it doesn't necessarily mean these are just purely 157 press releases or offers for op-eds. Some of them are newsletters or, fast mails out from, for example, like Eureka Alert, which keeps you updated on what are the latest embargoed scientific papers or the most recent scientific papers that have been published for the day. So one email can have 20 or sometimes more links of the latest research papers and scientific papers. That's a lot, right? There's so many things to read. There's so many papers, and a lot of them are interesting, but journalists are usually very short on time. And these days, particularly with the media industry, there's a lot of, I'm sure you must have, there's a lot of upheaval in terms of, budget cuts, problems with financing, the audience being fragmented. It's no longer the case of big newspapers and big televisions. We now have social media. We now have so many different platforms to get your news from. So it can be like I said, overwhelming to get that many offers of news reports and papers being published and people, offering either to be interviewed or writing op-eds. So how can you cut through and make sure that, if you or your, press officer, comms officer write an email to a journalist, it will cut through all of the rest of the emails where the journalist, and usually I have to admit, what I do is I will look at the top line, the subject line in the email, and I will look at the headlines and the first couple of paragraphs of the email or a scientific paper, just to see if I'm interested and if it relates to the topics I'm interested in. And if not, it goes to the bin. So how do you craft content that will cut through all that noise and get journalists to say, this looks really interesting. I want to follow up, or even just to say, I want to read this op-ed. I want to read this interview with this scientist, with this researcher, because that seems something really interesting. Next slide, Agnes. Great. So the good news is that I'm not going to repeat a lot of what on this slide, because Ulrika has already done that, which is particularly talking about the newsworthiness. But I want to talk about the first part, right? Why are you writing an op-ed, or why are you offering an interview? Why are you doing this? Do a little bit of homework, right? Before you talk about the research that you've just published, the findings, take a few moments to think, what do you want to get out of it? What is the objective? Is it to share the findings? Is it because, like Ulrika or Salom earlier said, it's a paper that has come out a few years ago, but the findings are very relevant, or that perhaps suddenly everybody is talking about a topic that you've been researching for years and you have a unique perspective, an interesting perspective to share. So think about why you are writing this, or why you are communicating, what you want to achieve, and also try and think about, who are you writing for? Are you writing for a local media outlet, an international media outlet? Are you writing for people within your research institutions or academic institutions? Are you writing for an external audience? And even when I say external audience, are you writing for the general public? Or are you writing for people who are not scientists or researchers, but who already knows the topic and are following it? Or are you writing it for policymakers? Are you writing it in a magazine or in newspapers that lawmakers read? So knowing which outlet you're going to be writing for, or you'll be talking to, even if it's an interview, who is the audience, who reads this paper, who watches this television channel, who goes to this website. It will really help you when you try and formulate your messages and what you want to do, right? Ulrika talked about newsworthiness, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but these are, as the journalist, these are the things that we look through before we say, okay, we're going to write a news article on this topic. We are going to speak to this person. We are going to read this particular article. What is the impact? Big, small? Is it relevance? What's the proximity? Is it something that happened a long time ago now? Who is involved? Is there conflict? Is there human interest? Is it new, predictable, right? And one other thing I want to add that's not on the slide is, journalists will think of newsworthiness and determine, whether they should write an article, they should interview a scientist, they should cover a new research paper on these, on these ingredients, let's just say. But it also helps a lot if you already have good relationships with journalists. If you already have a couple of journalists that you can call up and say, hey, I've got a paper coming out. Would you be interested? Right? And I think Rugando, after me, will be talking a lot about building relationships with journalists. So I don't want to go into detail, but I just would like to encourage all of you to start building these relationships. don't be scared of journalists. I know that sometimes a lot of scientists and researchers worry about being misquoted or worry about, again, the whole on the record, off the record things. Journalists are humans too. There are good journalists and there are bad journalists. There are people who will, honor this relationship and will want to build on it. The key thing, of course, and that's where your communications officer can help, or also, just meeting journalists, talking to them through mutual friends and connection could really help. So for me, what I normally do is, because I have a lot of scientists and researchers that I have spoken over the years, sometimes they will contact me and say, I've got a paper coming out, and I will be like, and I'd be willing to give them more time. I'll be honest, to look through and say, okay, will this work? Is this interesting? And then what I normally do is I would interview them. I would read the paper. I'd have, questions. I would ask tough questions, particularly around methodology, particularly if the scientific paper is extremely technical and full of jargon, because my role is to make sure that I understand the paper well so that I can write in a way that ordinary people can understand, right? So I'll speak to journalists and, sometimes I will double check my quotes with them. Depends on the timeline. If it is a new story that needs to go out today, it's a bit hard. But what journalists can still do is, if it is a very short news story that they need to interview you for, the timeline will be very tight, but it also means it won't be a half an hour, 1 hour interview. It will more likely be 10, 15 minutes. And they should still be able to just sort of double check over the phone. So this is what it means. If I have a bit more time, what I will normally do is, we can't show the article before it goes to print. That is just not done. We can check some quotes. Or what I will do is I will call the scientists up, the researchers up, or I will email them to say, this is what I understand to be the findings in terms of how it would impact people on their everyday lives, right? You've written a scientific paper in a very scientific topic, but what does it mean in practice? What does it mean in reality to the average Joe? And I will do that with researchers, with scientists, and also sometimes what I will do is, if I see a really interesting scientific paper, but I'm not sure whether the findings are robust, I will, there are a few scientists and researchers that I will call up to say, would you mind, just almost doing a peer review for me? Obviously, it depends on their availability and their time, but I think it's really worth building those relationships, because it will really help when you approach them to cover your research paper or to publish your op-eds or interviews with you. Next slide, Agnes. So I want you to, this is the process that we follow. When I say we, I'm talking about journalists. Most journalists, when they write news stories, this is the process we follow. And I want you to think like a journalist before you start writing, pitching your op-eds, or when you, even do your interviews. There's obviously op-eds and features are slightly different, but thinking it this way will still help you communicate clearly and craft content that's compelling. So we call it the inverted pyramid for writing news. Why is it the inverted pyramid? Because it's the exact opposite of how we normally tell stories. So for example, I had a really interesting, encounter on a bus when I was going to work. Normally, how do we tell these stories to our colleagues, to our family, saying, hey, this morning I was on a bus and there was this interesting thing happen. That's not how news is written, right? The first paragraph, the first sentence is what happens on the bus, right? The interesting thing that comes first. And usually what we call is, an active lead that includes 6 W's. So that's who, what, where, when, why, and usually, so what. So what is, why should people care? Why does this matter, right? It puts the most important and juiciest information at the top of the story, And then the rest of the information comes in order of descending importance, right? Part of this comes from the old days when we, when the newspapers were, sent to printing press, and there is a premium in terms of space, in terms of how much you can publish of a news story. So the first paragraph or the first line is an active lead that includes the 6 Ws. The second para will answer some of the questions in the lead or give more information. And then for the third paragraph, we put what we call a golden quote in our news stories. A golden quote is a quote from somebody. It could be yourself, the lead author, the lead researcher, about why this news story, why what you're writing is important. It shouldn't be a repeat of what was already said in the first 2 paragraphs. To me, a golden quote is something that is vivid, that is emotional, and that sort of explains things in a way that is easy to understand, and for readers to, just read it and go, I should care for this. This is why. And then you put in, in descending order, what is the context? What is the context of this scientific research? What is the context of this particular news story? And then you can put in reaction, numbers, analysis, more quotes, background, and deep background. Like I said, this is writing news. Op-eds will be slightly different, but it is still very, very important, I think, to imagine writing it in a way that will attract readers as well as journalists. Next slide, please. So these are the elements of a good news story, which I think is also applicable for an op-ed. You need a good headline, a powerful lead, something that in the first sentence or couple of sentences summarizes your research, your findings, a great golden quote that lifts the story. Op-eds, it might not necessarily work. You might not necessarily have a quote that you might want to put in, but then think of it in a way as to what can I say about the findings that are most significant that will capture people's attention. Avoid long sentences. In other words, use short sentences, simple words, and understandable language. You want numbers and statistics. Journalists like numbers and statistics, data, right? But make sure that it's not too heavy. No jargons or acronyms unless absolutely necessary. I think Siloam also talked about it, and I just want to really emphasize, I think scientists and researchers, particularly those working in climate change and food, have so many jargons and acronyms, but you need to make it understandable to journalists and ordinary people. It needs to flow well, it needs to be orderly, and again, like what Salon said, use active voice instead of passive voice. The same thing with a good headline as well. We were always taught a good headline always has an active verb, not a passive thing. Next slide. Now, you've written your op-ed or you've planned, your press release, whatever. How can you incorporate visuals? I would definitely recommend using visuals in your op-eds, in your articles, to lift the story, to lift what you're writing. Then you have to decide, do you use photos, do you use videos, or do you use infographics? A lot of will depend on where this will be published, who the audience is, and of course, what resources you yourself have, right? If your institution have the resources to make a video or have really good, picture archive or turn it into data illustration, I would really recommend to do it. Now, you have to make sure if you're using photos or videos that you are not reinforcing stereotypes. What do I mean by that? So if we're talking about food insecurity, don't just put pictures of people from the global south. malnourished. Or if you're talking about, if your paper is about female-headed households being affected more by climate-induced crop failures, don't just put pictures of, women crying. Don't reinforce stereotypes that poverty and hunger and malnutrition happens only in the global south, or that women have no agency and need saviors. So you need to make sure that if you use photos and videos, and even with infographics as well, don't reinforce stereotypes. It's really important. And also important sometimes to understand that what seems normal in a particular cultural context might not work regionally or globally. So it's important to think of that as well. If you're using infographics, I only have a couple more slides and I want to just show you some examples. Make it easily understandable. Agnes, can you share the next slide? So I don't think I'm telling you anything different, but I want you to, compare the text on the left column, and the image on the right-hand column, right? I am a writer. I am predominantly a text reporter. I'm a multimedia journalist, but I love writing and I love reading. But I will be the first to admit as well that a good illustration tells way more than what words can do. So on the left, it talks about how, this is based on an FAO report about plastic use in the agricultural sector, right? It talks about how Asia is the largest user of agricultural plastic products, accounting for almost 70% of the global use of films. I mean, you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot. But then you look at the illustration on the right and you see, when you read it, like almost 70%, yeah, that's a lot. But then you see how big a difference between Asia and the rest of the world. And you even see the difference between 2018 and 2030, how it is projected to grow. So with that little illustration, immediately, okay, this is a problem particularly in Asia, and it is going to be an even bigger problem if we don't do anything about it. Next slide, please. It's from the same report. Again, if you look at the left-hand side column, it talks about how, how much of plastic was used in agriculture for non-packaging purposes, right? And it gives you a breakdown of where it is used and how it is used. And then on the right, it tells you, of the non-packaging, that's 0.71 million tons, where do these go to? And it makes so much, to me at least, it's so much clearer and makes so much more sense and understandable to say, oh my goodness, okay, so this is the breakdown of the plastic use in agriculture. Again, so much clearer for people to understand looking at this rather than just reading long paragraphs about data and statistics. Next slide, please. So the next two, this slide and the next slide, are from the Food Systems Countdown report, which came out early last month, right? That it's the first comprehensive breakdown into the state of food systems worldwide. To me, this is much more difficult to understand than the previous report. Agnes, can you show the last slide as well? This one is even more difficult to understand, but I think for you, the last two slides would be something that you're a lot more familiar with. It is great for scientists, not great for ordinary people. But I think for this particular instance, it's fine because these were used in policy briefs and an article in Nature Food. So they're not op-eds for The Economist or The Washington Post or The Guardian or The Conversation, but these are for very specific scientific audience, for other researchers and scientists, or for policymakers and their advisors who would have the background to understand complex, graphics. But I wanted to show you these two slides and contrast it with the first two so that you understand what I mean by making illustrations understandable to the ordinary people and to journalists as well. So I hope that is useful and interesting, and I'll be here to take questions later on as well. That's it for me. Thank you. I hope it didn't go over time too much.
No, you're fine. Thanks, Dane. Thanks for that interesting and insightful conversation on how to craft compelling content and how to incorporate use of visuals in our communications. Now, I think it's time for a stretch break. So we'll take 5 minutes. And when we come back, we have a very interesting session with Arinaitwe Rugendo. Our names sound very familiar. And he will take us through how to engage with media outlets. And he has very interesting case studies to share with us. So we'll take 5 minutes and we'll be back at around, in the next 5 minutes, we should be starting up again. Thank you. And please remember to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen so that we can answer all your questions at the end of the webinar. We are dedicating 30 minutes to any questions you might have. So remember to put your questions there and the speakers will be at hand to answer them. So we'll take a 5-minute break. See you then. Thank you so much to everyone who's still here with us and those who are newly joining us. Welcome to this webinar where we're discussing the importance of science communication, especially for researchers who are in food systems and agriculture. We've heard from 3 speakers, and now we're moving on to the last 2 speakers. And now we are joined by Rugendo, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of Research Find News in Uganda. And he'll be taking us through how to build relationships with journalists and engaging the needs of different media outlets. He'll be expounding more to what Thien has talked about. So Rugendo, if you're ready, over to you. You can turn on your video and unmute yourself. Just to remind the audience, we still have room for questions. If you've not posted your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, kindly do so. And we will be having a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Over to you, Rugendo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. May I have the screen? Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, of course, my colleagues have really touched on quite a lot. And maybe I will first of all, introduce myself. My name is Arinaitwe Rugendo, and I'm editing a pioneer website called Research Finds News Uganda. This is a website that is focused on translating research products into news products using a newsification model. And I've been a journalist for the last 22 years, and particularly in the print media sector. And I'm also a media entrepreneur at the same time, and currently a scholar. So I emphasize this as a practical way now to basically validate what my colleagues have been talking about. They've been more theorizing, but then at Research Finds News Uganda, we've been able to successfully pioneer what they've been telling you, what they've just been presenting into practical ways. And we have products to show for that, and even evidence of how industry has been able to nexus with media and generate products out of what we write. Next slide, please. So first of all, why do researchers and media need each other? Because I think that's the most important thing where to begin from. But because one of the reasons is, my argument is that an argument that Research Finds News Uganda, they speak to themselves in journals, they speak to themselves in dissertations, they speak to themselves through projects, and they think from that point, from that context, they've actually impacted the world, and that's the biggest challenge that we see, and why I think then researchers need media to be able to now speak to the masses, to be able to translate their research, to translate their findings into meaningful products for the masses to be able to consume. Because we are into research, we are into academia to be able to transform society. And if that is at the back of our mind, then we need to move away from speaking to each other alone or exclusively, and take it beyond that and be able to speak to the masses for whom our findings are meant. And so therefore, we argue that findings become the only way, the pathway to the masses, because once we've theorized, once we've backgrounded our research, and we've gathered all the literature that is necessary, including the theoretical frameworks and all this that we talk about when we are talking about research, then it is the findings that matter. Normally, my supervisors ask me about the contribution. What is the thesis in your research? And for me, that thesis that they ask about is particularly the fact that the findings must be able to speak to your intentions, to your motivation for the research. And colleagues have been talking about the audience. Colleagues have been talking about why you do what you're doing, why are you communicating what you're trying to communicate. And I think, and so the
Rugendo, are you still there with us? I think we've lost you.
Now the media are not particularly speaking directly to the masses, and that is important because the policy briefs, the seminars have been targeting policymakers, and policymakers, well, are expected to translate our research products, our policy, our recommendations down to the masses. But you see, research that is not translatable to the masses, I think, is not impact research enough. And so, you need a channel then that speaks to the masses, that connects you to the masses. And this is mainly the media channels. And now, in all this, we're arguing that a newsification model has been missing. And I think Win has really talked about this quite greatly. And we also saw a demonstration from Ulrika. The point is that we're trying to argue that maybe research needs to get beyond the existing models of translating research and use a newsification model. A newsification model is where you turn findings into news stories. And we've seen how we are supposed to do that. And then, of course, media and researchers need each other because of the digitization trend. Digitization is disrupting different industries, different disciplines, including even agricultural and food systems. And so therefore, because of digitization that has come with, say, social media, has come with online media, has come with, now we talk about the metaverse, we are now talking about robotics journalism, that has now democratized the media to the extent that Win and I, who have been now the kings, the untouchables in the mainstream media or in the traditional media, have been demystified. And so everybody now can communicate. And I think this is very important. And this is why my fellow panelists were telling you about how to be able to simplify your findings for your particular audiences that you are targeting. So the digitization has now helped to democratize the media. And in that case, you are also in the media space. You are now beginning from here, I think, you're going to start thinking like journalists, because now you have digitization that has helped to democratize the media and taken you into this space to be able to get your findings to where they matter, to where the people who matter and are supposed to consume your findings are located. And then, of course, I think somebody touched on it, on this. Researchers don't know the importance of media. Indeed, researchers, particularly scientists that I have been able to really engage with, have this fear for the journalists, and they think they'll be misquoted, or or probably they be discovered, or probably their research has been funded somewhere, and probably the money was not spent very well. And so therefore, if you start, hobnobbing with the journalists, they might discover what you might not have done very well, and probably your funders might also discover what you didn't do well. But I think we need to get out of that. Why should we get out of that? Because why are we doing research? We're doing research to be able especially in food systems and climate change. We are supposed, and I think food security. We are trying to do that, to do research in this particular context, to be able to help society, to be able to move society, to be able to build food systems that last, that are able to save lives. And so therefore, we need the media. We must now understand the importance of it. It's only the media that will take us to where we want to be, to take us to where the people who are supposed to consume our research are found. And then, of course, I also want to blame ourselves, Win and I, that we've been over time aloof to science communication. We think the story that matters now, like in Uganda right now, is the corruption in parliament. It is the upcoming elections. It is the conflict in Congo. It is the war in Israel, in the Gaza Strip. It is so. Therefore, science tends not to get us there. Although, of course, there are research products in this context where we also have research on wars, research on conflicts and stuff. But then there is that kind of to interest the popular masses. For example, if you're talking about research in some groundbreaking research in architecture, in bananas, and that's the story that you'll not find on the front page of a newspaper or in prime news time at a television station, simply because they are rushing for what is catching, what is grabbing the attention of the public, particularly wars, conflicts, who has stolen what, and we tend to get, masses tend to get carried away, and I think this is why it was important, especially I think Ulka was presenting, and I think Winnie, about making our stories, our policy briefs interesting to the journalist, being able to establish a relationship with, this is the next where we're going to be coming to now. When you establish your relationship with the journalist, then you tend to, you get to understand what interests us. What is it that out of this number of pages that you've published, what is interesting that we think will grab the attention of the public, of the masses, and also compete with the corruption story, we compete with the election story, compete with the war story in the Gaza Strip, something like that. So let's go to the next slide. So how do we then build relationships with journalists? First of all, know the journalist's role, and I think somebody touched about this very, very well. The journalist's role is not to be a co-PI with you, is not to be your research assistant. No, theirs is to gather and disseminate interesting, sometimes unusual news, and I think that has been very well tackled. What is so interesting? What is unusual? News is not what we all know. It must be something that is unusual, that is unknown. What is so unknown about your findings? What is so unknown about your recommendations? And sometimes what is your knowledge contribution particularly is something perceived to be new, and so therefore that becomes a news story. And I think if I remember very well, this is what actually inspired us to start Research Minds News, because when I went for the PhD, I discovered that there was quite a lot of stuff, of information, of new knowledge that was hidden in journal articles, and some of these databases are not easily accessible to journalists and media houses. They're only accessed by our institutions, our academic institutions, where we speak to ourselves, where we speak, like I normally like to use the adage, preaching to the choir. Imagine you're running a church and you're only preaching to the choir, not to the congregation. So the congregation has been out of the circuit, of the orbit of research across the world, and research, the research orbit is within the libraries. It's within the graduate studies, the graduate schools, the academic institutions, the people on the streets for whom these findings are meant are not in the research orbit. So therefore, it becomes very important to bridge that. You need the journalist or the media in this case, to be able to bridge that so that we take out all these findings, all this interesting information out of our libraries or out of our digital shelves and take it down there to them, and then they understand what we want. And in a way, it also helps once that bridge is built. The assumption is that one, policy is enhanced, but also importantly, the entrepreneurial world, the enterprise world might be able to connect with the researchers and develop products that can be enterprised, products that can be turned into business models, into business products, and therefore we are able to then to enhance industry, to enhance entrepreneurship, create jobs, and make research impactful enough. Of course, journalists have both professional burdens. You need to understand them. Somebody explained this very well. Deadlines, they're working around making sure within their deadlines, they must make sure they get everything accurate. You need to understand their burdens that they carry. We also need to appreciate their challenges. As you're trying to build this relationship, what are the challenges that the journalists face? They are working in a fast-paced environment. They are competing. In Uganda, we have about 140 online media houses. Every other week, I think a new media house, springs up online, and so therefore, competition is very, very stiff. Your story has to be very competitive, and you have to understand in the environment in which they are operating. And of course, there's huge amount of information that is coming to them. You are not the only researcher that is contacting me. There are so many. In Uganda, we're talking about over 42 universities that are active. So if every researcher has to get to research finds news, that means then we are really dealing with a lot of information. So empathy is important towards understanding our challenges that we go through. And then, of course, respond promptly to journalist inquiries. Win really talked about this very well, and also Ulrika talked about this very well. I don't need to repeat it. Be accessible. Are you accessible? Or you're this difficult, hard knock researcher who is dealing with nature, who is dealing with Lancet, who is dealing with science director, and therefore you find this newspaper, not very important, as long as for you, your article, has gotten into Lancet, and that's it. But you see, we are talking about pandemics in rural areas. We are talking about foot and mouth disease now in Uganda, in the central region and in the western region. This is what we're talking about. Somebody, a farmer who is faced with pests, he does not know about Lancet. So you must be able to reach them. How do you reach them? You need the journalists. Then, of course, in building these relationships, simplification is important. It is very, very important. For instance, somebody talked about this very well, but I need to add and say, always keep in mind the 8 C's of communication. Clarity. Number one is clarity. How is your text that you're sending me clear, and precise? Be concise, coherent. You understand this. Coherence is important. Consistency is very important. Courtesy. How courteous are you in the way you're communicating? I think when he talked about, which I really resonated with very well, stereotyping. That hunger, that refugees are only in the global south. And therefore, they need American aid. They need all this stuff. That is not the best way to go about it. And then be considerate enough. We talked about the inverted pyramid. It helps really in terms of ensuring that the story is simple. The 5 W's and H, somebody talked about this. Exclusiveness. Journalists like people who give them exclusive information. We call them scoops in our newsrooms. If you've given an exclusive interview to me, don't give it to my competitor because you want to reach everywhere. No, if you've given it to me, let it stay with me. If you have something you've discovered, if you have an interesting finding in your study, that makes it a scoop for me. I want to scoop the other media house. This is how you are supposed to build that relationship with me. Understand that we are interested in scoops, in exclusive facts. We want exclusive access to your laboratories. We want leaks. Leak for me something. Why is, for example, let me speak now to the Ugandans here who are very familiar with what is going on in the parliament, where a huge corruption scandal is being exposed. And it's being exposed because somebody inside parliament, the parliamentary commission, was able to leak certain documents, certain journalists, brave journalists who are now media. That's what we're talking about. That's what interests the journalists. The person who received that leakage from somebody who is inside parliament, they were able to build that relationship. So leak to us your findings. Give us exclusive access. Give us scoops. If you found very interesting findings, before everybody, the whole world knows, who is that journalist whom you think you should make that phone call to and say, look here, Rugendo, something is interesting here. Can you have a look at it? There are some facts and figures which are very interesting here. That's what we love. We don't love anything that is obvious to everybody. We want to be able to be on top of each other. We are always competing. I want to be able to be the first to break that story that 70% of people in the global south at least live on 2-3 meals a day. That's very, very important. If that is the new information that you've found in your research, especially where you're dealing with food systems. Of course, build long-term relationships. How do we build them? Go beyond these official statements and press releases. Go beyond these, official interactions with the media and build personal relationships. Engage in informal interactions and networking events. You have your networking events. You have your own, contexts within which, as academia, research, discuss, engage, involve journalists. Engage them, build that personal relationship, take them along your journey. Give them interesting things. Journalists are also looking for, simple things, especially in the global south. Journalists want to probably up their career. They want to improve on their career. Is it possible that probably you as an academician or as a researcher are able to, for example, access some of these avenues for these journalists to be able to get them to move from where they are and improve their capacity to be able to interpret your findings? Very, very important. And also afterwards, once they've done some good job, acknowledge them. We want to be pampered. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be told that we actually contributed. We were part of this groundbreaking research that saved lives. And the story that actually came out that was able to help very many people access this research product itself was through our hands. So acknowledge our contributions. Let's go to the next slide. So how do we then understand the needs of different media outlets? In the first 2-3 slides, I was dealing with the individual journalists and how to get them to you. And that is very, very important. But also remember, journalists also work for media houses, and media outlets have their own needs, and you need to understand them. The first one is, let us understand the media landscape. We've been hidden in our research carousels, in our labs. We may not understand how the media out there is structured. You need to understand that media is radio, is television, is newspapers, is online news websites, is social media. This is very, very important for you to understand how each one of these categories work, or in which context they disseminate information. If you're dealing with radio, then you're dealing with audio. If you're dealing with TV, you're dealing with audio visual. If you're dealing with online, you're dealing with texts, but fast-paced texts. Social media, same story, especially where probably you might want to using probably through your press officer or your communications officer or communications assistant, or you've probably come up with your own social media page. I want to encourage that, each one of you, since you are now going to start thinking as journalists, it is important to become your own media houses. And the best way to become your own media houses is through either creating a website or you are able to create your social media page on Facebook, or Twitter, or even a channel, a YouTube channel, so where you are able to speak to your research findings in a simple language and before a camera or a video camera, and then you are able to upload it on your channel if you have established now those relationships with the journalists. Some of the products or the stories they run, or the videos they take of you, can be channeled to your own channel, so that you also build your own profile. It's also important as researchers to build your own profile using the media, beyond the journalist. If you have now built the relationship with the journalist, how are you able to also build your own channels, your own LinkedIn pages, your own Facebook pages? What do you post there? Your own Twitter handles, X handles for that matter. I don't know how many of you have these, or if you have them, how are they active? I was quietly trying to go through some of your names and try to see what you're doing on social media. If each of you has a Twitter handle, so that I can follow you, or you follow me back, or to see what you're doing. Most of you are not very, very active. You open your channels and you're just there. This is what I'm trying to talk about. Try to understand where do you fall, where can you easily actually become your own media house, because you may not be able to reach Win. Win has a lot of things she's doing. You may not be able to reach me because I'm not the only media channel, but there are also other channels which also have their own focus. For instance, you might find that certain newspapers are not interested in science stuff, or they're not interested in research stuff. They're interested in following politicians. So it is important to understand who, which media house, which media outlet is actually speaking to your interest, your research interests, for example, particularly in my case, Research Finds News. Then once you've understood now, of course, this media landscape, and understood which outlet or which category really speaks to you, then tailor your communication accordingly. If you have opened up your own YouTube channel, or you've opened up your own Facebook page or LinkedIn page, tailor that communication to yourself and use the tricks, use the tools that my colleagues have given. Of course, I had said this, I've spoken to this, recognize the diverse preferences and requirements of various media outlets. I've explained this. And then understand their tone, style, and ideology. I think I explained this. For example, at Research Find News, our ideology is newsification. Yes, newsification of research findings. That is our ideology. And if you understand it, then deal with us, or deal with whichever media house that speaks to your ideology as well. The ideology of the media house will be that speaks to your research interests, for example. Of course, then media houses also have operate in a political economy environment. They are enterprises. You need to understand, most of them are no longer public service media. These are profit-oriented media enterprises, or industries that are dealing in communication goods. So understand that they are enterprises, understand that they trade in communication goods, understand that they have communication budgets or communication challenges or resource challenges. Please allocate some of your communication budgets to some of these media houses that you want to deal with, so that they can be able to work with you, And media houses also treat audiences as clients. If your story, your research is not able to bring me audiences enough for me to be able to turn to enterprise them, it becomes a bit difficult. So therefore, that is how it is. And then content categorization, somebody talk about this, and I've already explained it. Let me go to the other slide now. So our story, I've already explained it. Our mission is to make sure that the research reaches the masses, and there is our motivation is that there is a dearth of knowledge about findings in the public realm, about research findings that is existing, and that's what we're trying to bridge. Our goal is to bridge research and industry, and we aim to make sure that researchers like you become front page news. It shouldn't be only the politicians, it should also be about groundbreaking research and the people behind them. They should begin to be part of the front page news or the prime news. And so how do we do it? We mine journal articles, we mine policy briefs, we mine dissertations, and we also engage in interviews. And our model, follows the mix between academic rigor and using a journalistic flair to be able to tell the story. Let's go to our last slide and then I conclude. This is the last slide where we have had impact. These stories, the middle slide that you see, the middle picture that is, or frame that you picture, you see, I think this is a story that was done by Dr. Nagasha, the one who was just interviewed earlier on, you know, and her story was able to take her places. She has already explained it. And this is because we were able to publish this story the way we did it. The other one, the third frame was about research about sexual violence in the Ugandan police, and how it was connected to inadequate housing. When we did this story, the researcher was invited by the police chief here in Uganda, and they worked together to be able to improve housing across the country. And right now, housing in all police barracks, everything is being done to ensure that housing is improved because of this research and what her findings were able to speak to. The first frame, of course, shows what we've been able to do or what we are doing in different areas, medicine, agriculture, and other sectors. Thank you very much, and I'll be able to entertain questions at the end of this session.
Thank you so much, Rugendo, for that insightful session. Now we move on to our last speaker, who is Molly Bird, who's also joining us from the Stockholm Environment Institute, who will talk to us about communicating your research using social media. Molly works as a communications project manager, and she'll take us through this last session. Over to you, Molly.
Great, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, so I appreciate everyone staying until this long. I know it's been a long 3 hours, so thank you for your attention. I'm going to start off with a bit of interaction. So please prepare yourself to go to Mentimeter for a quick interactive activity. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is how you can communicate your research on social media. And already all the other speakers have already touched on the power of communication and why we want to communicate research. So I won't dwell too much on that. I think the points have already been really powerful. And Erin Naitwe has really introduced why we want to be on social media as researchers already for me. So thank you for that. So I'm going to spend, I have a 30-minute slot, but I might be a bit quicker. Let's see. I'll try and keep time. We're going to start with Mentimeter, so please use the QR code here or go to menti.com and use the code that I've given there and also put in the chat. And I'm going to touch on certain things throughout this presentation. I'll talk about what is social media. I'm sure many of you know, but I will just quickly talk about it and how it's unique to the other media outlets we've talked about today. I'll also talk about what is success on social media for you as researchers. I also want to touch on why should you bother being on social media? What is it in, like, why will you benefit from being on social media? And then I'll give some tips and also some inspiration for how you can plan ahead for your own social media presence in advance of your exciting research launches and new policies, new briefs, new research that you'll be sharing. And I was going to leave time for a Q&A at the end of my session, but I realized we have a big Q&A at the end of the whole session, so I'll leave that off. So if you could all go to Menti, I'm just going to go to a different, to my Mentimeter screen instead. Okay, so this first section is scales. I'd really love to see where you're all at with using social media for work-related activities. And I'm saying work-related activities to mean where you're sharing your research, where you're engaging with other people's research, where you're reading media about your research topics that you're involved in. So it could be anything related to social media. And we're watching live. This is really interesting and great for me to see. So already there's lots of you, 3.8 out of 5 are already using social media for work-related activities, and this is fantastic. And I'm really happy to see that. But there's also a real interest here for you to use social media more. So that's also great. I'm going to give you some inspiration as to how you can do more and give you some best practice examples as well. And also great for me to see what priority you're giving social media right now. I appreciate everyone is very busy across all sorts of things, and as we've just heard, you also want to be thinking about how you engage with your journalists and media amongst all your other priorities. So I can understand that. And this is also really interesting, this last one, how many of you are preparing to post on social media in advance of a key date. And this is over the halfway point, so I'm very excited to see this. This is great. I'll just give a few more moments. We have had 26 respondents, that's about half, so I think that's great. Give a few more moments while people join. Wonderful. Okay. And now for the next, this is the second part of this Mentimeter. I would really love to know what are the reasons that you're not using social media more for work? You have 3 really short answers here, so apologies you can't write a long response, but it would be great just to see what are people's reasons, what are the barriers at play for stopping you being on social media, promoting your research more. Okay, so I'll just pick out a few of these that are appearing here. So lack of time seems to be the biggest one here. That's the biggest word. So that's been repeated over and over by lots of you. There's talking a lot about lack of skill or not sure how to do it, or you're trying to not get distracted on social media, as it is a very, very distracting to be on there sometimes, so I do understand. And it's hard to communicate the complexities of your research. And there's loads more responses there, but thank you. That's given me a really good overview as to how you're all feeling about social media for your research, and how I can pitch this presentation. So I'm going to just return to my presentation now. So thanks for your participation. That was great. So as we already have just discovered, loads of you are on social media, so I'm not going to dwell on this slide for very long. We all know that that social media are apps and platforms that enable users to create and share content and participate across social networking. But what sets it apart from the other media outlets and speaking to journalists, which we've talked about before in this presentation, is that this is a communication tool which is two-way. So people can interact directly with you, and you can interact directly with the various people that you're trying to reach with your research and with what you're trying to communicate to them. So it does cut out the journalist, and it does mean that you can access maybe more niche communities as well, people who are really interested in your research, but it may not be reaching kind of global newsworthiness. So it has its own uniqueness, it has its pros and its cons. And interestingly, as of January 2023, 59% of the total global population are using social media all the time. So it's definitely where a huge proportion of the people you're trying to reach and communicate your research to are going to be on these platforms. And I just wanted to very briefly list here lots of social media platforms that I'm sure you're really familiar with. And I won't read them through and I won't go into all the detail, but there are just so many. So I do understand that it can be hard to know where to start or where to develop your social media presence across these various platforms. And I'm hoping that the rest of this presentation will give you a bit of an idea and also give you some evidence as to where decision makers are. And before I go any further, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is I don't just want to have this presentation trying to tell you how to get likes and shares and increase your number of followers on social media. For me, social media is a channel where you can make real change and meaningful, meaningfully inform and share your research to much wider groups of people than you may currently be doing. So it's success for me on social media is success for me on communications as a whole, which is informing, finding new partnerships, changing beliefs and changing behaviors based on the research that you're communicating about. And I will say it can be very challenging to measure success from just social media alone. I mean, we rarely will just share about a new piece of research on our social media. It might also be in op-eds, in journal articles, in policy briefs. So this is just one of the many avenues and many channels where you should be sharing your research and communicating it to much wider audiences. And why should you bother with social media? I mean, already a lot of you are on it. So I just want to highlight a few of the general benefits, but I think already so many of you are familiar with this, so I won't dwell too long on this slide. So it's where your existing audiences already are, and also it's where you can reach much wider audiences if you're able to really communicate to them in this compelling, exciting way, which the speakers already today have talked about how to do better. And as I said, you can talk directly with people you're trying to reach with your research. And I'm not saying talk directly to them. I'm very intentional here about saying talk with them. These social media platforms are where you can interact, you can have dialogue. It can be direct, direct messaging, or it can be comments on posts. So it's very interactive, and it's a very different way of communication than kind of any other channels allow for communication. It's really key as well to be communicating your research in very concise and summarized format with your key messages. And this is exactly what was also communicated already when you're pitching to journalists. There's also an increase in misinformation across the internet, including across social media. And you as a researcher and even as a research influencer can be counterbalancing that misinformation. And this can be really important voices that we need right now to stop misinformation growing. And this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. You can become an influencer. We do have scientific influencers out there, and they are really cutting through, and they do have impact. And I'm going to show you the empirical evidence of this in the next few slides. Okay. So, whoops, just go back. So I've taken some information from a communications agency based in Belgium, who create a poll every year since 2016. And they look at what sources of news have the most influence over EU decision makers. Now, before I go into more detail about what this poll shows, I do fully understand that this is only looking at EU decision makers, and I wish it was looking at, a global population of decision makers, but I hope it does give an indication of how decision makers globally are interacting with social media. So in this first graph, you'll see that they polled these decision makers how frequently they were using social media apps on a weekly basis. And you'll see in the first column here that you have, in 2023, 75% of EU decision makers were using WhatsApp and 60% were using LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, interestingly here, has had a 3% increase in usage since when they compared it with data from 2022. And you'll see they're on many different ones, but WhatsApp, LinkedIn, and X are the top three, which I think is interesting. Then they looked at which sources of news in general have most influence over EU decision makers. And they've looked at these, very well-known media outlets. But what I found was very interesting was in sixth place was X, which, as you know, was previously called Twitter, with 58% of having an influence as a news source for decision makers. And just to show exactly what this means, so 39% of those polled found it to be fairly influential, and 18% found X to be a very influential news source. And although that is just one of the channels, one of the social media channels that show up in this, they polled across many more news outlets. And I've just pulled out here, so they polled another 12 influential news sources, and there's 6 more social media channels that appear within that. And notably, LinkedIn at 45%. And then finally, I wanted to pull out this piece of information from the poll, which is what other forms of influence have influenced the decisions of these EU decision makers. And I really wanted to pull out this one section here, which is that social media influencers have jumped in influence on the decisions. It's now 46% of EU decision makers are influenced by social media influencers. And what I want to say is, like, this could be you. You could be a research influencer. We call them influencers, and maybe we think of, people traveling around on Instagram, but it certainly includes activists, academics, campaigners, journalists, and their voices are getting more and more clout. And the rise from 2022 to 2023 was 16%, which is really big. So I wanted to then talk about how do you start developing and creating your social media presence, because we've already established that decision makers are using social media all the time and that it's a key source of information for their decision making. So now we can look about how you can build a good presence on social media to become a trusted researcher and communicator. So already so many of you on social media, so I won't dwell on this first bit too much, but I do just want to make sure that you're thinking of your audiences, you're thinking of who you're trying to reach, who you're trying to communicate with about your research, and identify which platforms they're using. And it's these platforms which is where you should be considering building a social media presence. And once you've created an account, I would suggest these kind of 3 key basics for getting started. Make sure that you're filling in a full biography on any social media account you're on, and include a professional photo of yourself, because this really brings a lot more credibility and shows that you are real and that you are building your profile. Then you can start following and connecting with relevant researchers and other target audiences like journalists, organizations. You can follow pages and you can join communities and lists. And really these different ways of interacting are different on each platform, but they all have a similar approach, which is to make sure that you target exactly which communities you want to be interacting with, and where your research also is of interest to them. And then you can begin sharing and interacting with relevant posts from your peers, from target audiences, from thought leaders, and even start beginning to post yourselves. And I'm sure already, many of you are already at this point now. Then I wanted to also talk about planning your posts. I've seen that many of you are already doing this, which is fantastic to see. And I wanted to highlight 5 research stages here that are very generic, and really identify at each stage where you could be thinking and planning ahead for promoting about your work on social media. So at the start of initiating work on a new project, on a new piece of research, it could already be relevant for you to start sharing and announcing the work that you'll be working on and who you'll be collaborating with. And then if your research is accepted by a publisher and a publication data set, you can start creating key messages and a storyline and begin drafting posts and promoting any events associated with a launch, for example. And I'm sure my press and journalist colleagues will also be wanting you to, at these points too, think about who is it that will be interested in hearing about your research. Is there an op-ed you could be writing, for example? When it's the day of publishing, you already have your drafted posts, and I really encourage you to be timely. Always post on the same day if possible, and even in the same hour. It's really, social media time flies by, and you really want to make sure that you're communicating about new information, new research at the same time that it's possible to access it. And then if there's a key date or a promotional event that's relevant to research that you've just released, or even something that you released months or years previously, you can tie in and you can promote again that piece of research that you've published. You can talk about outcomes or discussions at events and give your insights and your input and add your value to the conversation on social media. And finally, at every one of these stages, if you do have communication support, I really encourage you to let them know about each of these key research stages, so they can help you craft compelling stories and also promote on your organizational channels as well. So I'm about to show you some examples of what I think are good and what are seen to be really good posts on social media. I've chosen 4 different social media channels, and I'll identify one of these 5 kind of key best practices for how you communicate on social media. So the first point is storytelling and bringing your authentic voice. You can use different language than you do when you're communicating in academic channels. And remember that it's not just researchers that you're communicating with, but it's all sorts of different audiences. So keeping the key messages and language really simple is great. And I'd say always make sure you're adding value. So you're not just repeating information that already exists, but that you're sharing new perspectives or new data based on your research and your expertise. I'll also be sharing posts that have a clear call to action. And what that means is that it's clear to the reader of your post what it is that they should do when they're reading about your post. Should they read your report? Should they watch your video? Should they be, I don't know, attending an event? What is it that they should do once they read your post? And also each of these examples I will show you follow the platform norms that they're on. So I first chosen a really simple video post from Instagram. This is actually from SLU's Instagram channel, but I think this is a perfect example that any of you could do yourselves on your own social media channels. And it's really just a very simple video with a researcher speaking to camera and talking about the new research and the fieldwork that they're currently doing. And then it's a really short, concise post that just gives the very basics as to what you will be watching in the video. And what's great about this post is that it really humanizes the researcher and the research that's happening and brings a new perspective and a new angle. And it's much different from that normal academic way of communicating. And people really respond well and like these sorts of posts. The next item I wanted to show you was a thread on X about a new report. And this was promoted by one of our researchers at SEI called Leo. And there are so many things I can pull out about how good this thread is. Excuse me. But firstly, I wanted to say it's following the norms of X, which is creating a thread, which is telling a story about a new piece of information, in this case, the report, across a number of posts that are all connected to each other. And it's really simple to do, but it's quite hard to do well. And she's done this really well. She's labeled each of the posts with a number, so it's very clear to know how to read through them in the right order. She's linked to the report. She's made it timely. She's put that it's a report that's released and it's out now. She's identified the collaborators, so it was a UNEP report with research from SEI, and she's included relevant hashtags. So it can be really easily found and searched for on social media. And then I've pulled another example, and this is from Facebook. And the reason why I pulled this example is that it's showing 3 authentic images. We talked about visuals already, about making sure that they're authentic and that they are not misrepresenting or following stereotypes. And what I love about this post, and this is something that all of you can do, is it's telling the story about new research that's happening. It's explaining the research in quite a short, concise way, but And then we have a call to action, which is linking to the study, so you can read more about the study. This is just giving a taster. And what I really love here is that the photos, each of the 3 photos has a description of exactly what you're looking at and how it's relevant to the study. And then finally, I wanted to give 3 examples on LinkedIn. And I just want to highlight how each of these 3 examples are different and they bring an authentic voice. And Ngendo doesn't know I'm going to be showing her here, so but I thought it was a great example. So on the left here, we have a new journal article being promoted by a researcher. Then we have Ngendo, who is promoting the new launch of a new cookbook that's out. And then we have also Pershon, who's the research director at SEI, who is sharing a post from our organizational channel. And each of these 3 are trying to do different things, but all 3 of them are communicating with an authentic voice. And it's really talking about the excitement that Ngendo feels about trying these new insects that are cooked in a new way. It's also saying that she's excited, getting ready to travel to a new summit. And it's also John here who's talking about how he talked with a colleague and how it's led to this paper. So I really want to encourage all of you to find your authentic voice on social media when you're bringing new information, new research, new perspectives. Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so I am not going to go through this slide in full, but it is here, so in case you have time to look back at the recording, these are some really good tips that I've already kind of covered, but that are summarized on this slide. And the main thing I want to highlight here is that even if you follow all these tips, communications is about consistency and building trust. And it takes time and consistency to create a good social media account and build that presence and that trust. So just to conclude, I covered quite a lot in this presentation, and I hope not all of it was that new. I'm sure a lot of you are already on social media and working with it really well. I'd love to know in the Q&A as well if you have any good examples that you've worked on or that you've seen from others, and I'd love to see more links. But yeah, in conclusion, what I've covered here today is that we know decision makers are using social media, and not only that, but they are influenced by it as well. So even though it takes time to build your social media presence, it's definitely worth it, because there you can inform and you can influence decisions, and you can spread and reach wider audiences with your research. So that's all from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you for putting me on the spot. Eating edible insects in Zimbabwe, really good examples on how authentic voice really matters when you're showcasing your research and communicating to the wider audience. Thanks again. So we do have some 22 minutes for Q&A, and I'll start with a question from, I hope I will not say your name wrongly, Ung, and they ask what's the percentage of policymakers or politicians who use research findings through media published, especially in the global South context? How do you follow up in the investment in research and development? And I think this ties to maybe how do you monitor what kind of impact your research has, if it's been published in the newspapers, if someone has picked it up and has mentioned it in a journal, or a policymaker has actually taken it up to influence policy. So maybe we can pose this question to Ulrika.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are several ways to follow up. You can never find out everything, but when we research publications at SEI, we use 2 tools. I think they're called Overton and Altmetrics. I'm not super good at them, so I won't go into details, but that's a way to follow up how the scientific publications per se, how they are cited, where they show up. And I think that at least in one of these tools, you can also follow up in mainstream media, some at least, and also on social media. For mainstream media, we are following broadcast, radio, TV, and also print media and online media. Print media is a bit more tricky since it costs a lot to get access, but we can cover some at least. And what we can see is if we are published in, for example, the media that Molly showed in her presentation for EU policymakers. So we know that if we have research important for, let's take this example, EU decision makers, we can check how often are we published in Politico, in Euractiv, in Financial Times, etc. And we can measure both like reach, which is potential reach, which is always a dream figure. We can see how many articles, we can see how much of the article we take up. Are we mentioned in the headline, in the intro text? Do we take the whole interview, or are we just like mentioned, a short quote or a study made by Stockholm Environment Institute? So there are different parameters we can check, both quantitative and qualitative. And I think it's very important to look at both, so you can get a better picture. And the more you are seen in, for example, an article than in Politico, if you are the main researcher interviewed, the bigger is the possibility that the target audience of that media outlet, which then would probably be a decision maker in the EU, will see your research. But I should also underline that it will not be enough to just be there present once. You have to continuously be seen in the media to be like, to make your research more visible. If that is answer enough on the question. Otherwise, please ask more.
Okay, thank you for the response. We also had a question in the chat from Sophia Bokvist, and her question is, for researchers who have little or no support from communicators in their universities, how should they take their first steps to reach out? And this question maybe can be answered by Rugendo.
Yes, thank you. I think first of all, to begin with, I think if we go with the last presentation, I think we need to begin with, you can carry out a survey first of all. Let's know their feelings if they don't want to follow these accounts. So let's know their feelings. We get to understand basically what do they prefer, what do they want to hear about, how do they want to engage. And once you've done that, then we can also look at posting relevant content, because you might find that some of the kind of content you post probably is not quite interesting. Using the sort of tools we've given, it becomes very easy for you to be able to have the content that they want to hear, they want to see. So get their products, promote them, because I think if you're talking about university stuff, then it means they are actually engaged in some work, in some kind of research work. You see, most people want to read about themselves. They usually love that kind of feeling. They want to have that feeling that their work has gotten out there, and maybe this has never happened. And I think if we are talking about the global south here, this is something new that hasn't been happening before, and we're beginning to get there. So eventually, when they see their colleagues' stories out there, for example, like Dr. Nagasha here, in her case, for me, I was able to get even other colleagues of hers come to me and say, please, can I also have my product newsified? So if you have those accounts for the universities and the staff are not enthusiastic about them, start with a few and keep building up and keep building up.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions on social media, Molly, so I'll just try and combine them into one. Number one, would you advise someone to separate their accounts, for example, Instagram, a professional one and a personal one, or do they use the same account? There's also a question on how can staff follow and engage institutional social media accounts. There's also a question on touching on social media security in terms of hacking protection or anything on content plagiarism. Maybe we can bundle up those three into one.
Okay, thank you. I'll do my best to answer all of those, but do say if I've missed anything. The first question about having two separate accounts on Instagram is a really good question. And I'll also combine this with my answer for the other question about encouraging staff to follow and engage on institutional accounts. The policy that we have at SEI, and that I think makes a lot of sense, is that we can only encourage people to follow using their personal accounts to follow institutional accounts. We can't tell people what to do with their own personal channels. We don't kind of own people's personal social media, but we can of course encourage. And I think if you want to have a separation of your academic persona and your personal persona, it makes complete sense that you would have two separate accounts and that you wouldn't try and combine the two, because you're trying to present yourself very differently to different audiences. On one, you might want to share information with family and friends, and on another, you're trying to reach audiences to inform them about your research. So definitely separate those accounts and only associate your professional social media accounts with professional spaces on social media. And it might be that you want to be on Instagram on two accounts, or perhaps you maybe feel that LinkedIn is a better space to have your professional social media presence, and that Instagram is a better space for interacting on a personal presence. So you can mix the different accounts that and the different platforms that you're on based on who you're trying to reach with your research. So I hope that's answered those two questions. Well, I will just say that you can, of course, encourage people to follow institutional accounts, partly through training and familiarizing themselves with how to interact, but you can't really force anyone to interact with institutional accounts. So I hope that covers that question. And then the question on security and hacking. On almost all social media accounts now, there's this option to have a two-factor authentication, which is like a second way to ensure that only you are logging into your accounts and that others can't so easily log into your accounts with your logins. So don't share your logins, and set up two-factor authentication would be my tip for social media. And the question also asks about content plagiarism. We know that the kind of algorithms for what people are seeing on social media, the kind of top posts that appear on your social media feeds, are constantly changing. And we understand that when someone has directly copied a post and the wording is the same, the social media channels are able to see that, and they'll be less likely to re-promote that content widely. So there is kind of a disincentive for people to be directly copying your posts and sharing them on their channels, because they won't reach such wide audiences. But of course, you know, social media, because it's two-way and because anyone can contact anyone, it can be a bit more messy, and you can sometimes get, you know, unsolicited pushback or some random commentary on things that's completely irrelevant to what you're posting about. But this is normal. You don't have to respond, and it's fine to just ignore it, and you're still making sure that you're reaching wider audiences with the information that you're sharing.
Thanks,
I
Molly.
hope that answers it.
It does. Thank you. We have a question from Heather on what can researchers do to try to avoid inappropriate journalistic translations of language. For example, she had journalists in Uganda translate food insecurity as famine. Should we have a list of words or headlines primed? Maybe Thin can answer this question.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, some of it actually depends also on, I guess, the context and the event. So, for example, the FAO usually has the annual SOFI report, right? The state of food insecurity for the world. And they would always talk about undernutrition, and they would talk about food insecurity. And a lot of the journalists, you also have to understand, there are few journalists who would be focusing or specializing specifically on food security and food systems. There might be journalists who might be writing about politics one day, economy and the commodities the next, and then cover food security. So it's really important, I think, to be very clear when you talk about it. The good thing with the SOFI is that before it comes out, there will be a press release that will come out and then talk about food security or food insecurity as hunger, but different levels of hunger, acute hunger, chronic hunger. A lot of journalists don't understand it. I mean, I'm not sure whether having just a list of things to say, oh, these are avoid would eliminate it, just because you might not meet the same journalist again. It might be, a new journalist who might be coming in and needed. What helps, at least when I was just first starting out, was for scientists to use very, very clear language. So, if you say food insecurity, make sure you don't just constantly repeat food insecurity, help define it, right? You have the different pillars of what makes somebody food insecure, right? It's a very technical term, but for a lot of journalists, for scientists, we use different gradients between, oh, is it severely, undernourished, or is this just the IBC levels? So I think it's really helpful to try and explain in layman's terms what a technical terminology means. Of course, you can also have a list of most commonly mistranslated words, but there's also always the possibility that somebody will, slip through that crack. I think a more foolproof way is to make sure that, the journalist has the same understanding as you when you're using a technical term.
Thank you so much, Tin. Now, as we wrap up, I will ask my colleague Salom to answer the last two questions. This is a bit of an ambush, but he's a researcher turned communicator, so I think it'd be better placed to answer this question as you see fit. So when disseminating the research findings on social media, how can academics strike a balance? The question has gone before it was answered. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, when disseminating research findings, how can researchers when disseminating their research on social media, how can academics successfully strike a balance between upholding academic integrity and reaching out to the larger audience? This is a topic we've been discussing a lot at the Stockholm Environment Institute in terms of upholding integrity in research. Salom, I will be combining that question with the last one, which is if publications should be the only way to measure impact for researchers. Is there another way to change the assessment of this in the realms of science communication? So as we wrap up, Salom, maybe you can answer this in 1 minute.
Thank you. The first thing to notice is that having research integrity does not tie in only to you communicating in very complex ways. You can still have research integrity while actually simplifying your research for a wider audience. But the trick is to make sure that you don't lose too much of yourself in the process and engage in what would be sensationalism of the research phenomenon. So keep the sort of core message really defined in your communications and never lose that. Always have an idea of what the key message that you want to communicate is, but then tell a story around this key message to get people interested in the research. So you don't have to keep these technical jargons in your communication in order for you to have integrity. That's the key point to note about it. And many people have been doing these communications of very complex phenomenon and are able to do it really well without losing any integrity. So you can also do same. The second question, what was it again about policy?
About if publications should be the only measure of assessment, research assessment.
Oh, wow, that's a difficult one. Unfortunately, the academic community only measures, sort of success and expertise on the basis of publications, which is really erroneous because the university actually, or researchers have 3 core things that they need to do. They need to conduct research, they need to educate, and they need to communicate to the public. But you don't get a lot of weight attached to the communications to the public angle of things. And so the measure of who a good researcher is has been linked to publications. And that is really erroneous. I think that in the coming years, we need to find a way to change that and encourage more communication so that a better society can be built. This idea that researchers only, do publications and communicate to each other is really erroneous, especially given that we're using taxpayers' money to conduct all this research, and we are not seeing them actually understand or even benefit from the research that we're conducting. So it's a worldwide problem that all researchers are facing in different universities. It's a matter of how many you have done, and then you get a promotion on the basis of how many you have done. But we need to encourage high quality output and research that actually has an impact and has led to a policy or has an impact on the ground. That should be what we should prioritize, and rather than a lot of publications that perhaps do not go anywhere. But
Thank
just
you so
in
much.
this,
Yeah.
I'd like to say 2 quick things. That it's not enough to say that, hey, here's a new publication. As a researcher, try to develop an elevated pitch to get people interested in your paper, and when you post on Twitter or X or LinkedIn. And an elevated pitch is basically what you need to say in 1 minute, or to get the attention of a prime minister, for instance, about your research results. So cultivate that habit of what can I say in 1 minute actually in order to get somebody interested in my research. And try to write a LinkedIn post about your papers that you publish. I am also a culprit of this. I've not done this much, but this would help you to be able to, bring out the core message. It's not mainly about just summarizing what came up in your paper, but an angle that might be interesting for the public is good to showcase. The last thing I realized and I want to comment on is when we did the Mentimeter, there was this issue of being shy or lacking confidence that came up. And yes, many of us may be shy, but the thing is that after you conduct your research, you actually know something. So it's not enough to say anymore that I know nothing. And, this Socrates mantra that we all live by, I'm not sure I know enough, etc. Now you know something. You don't know enough in the research process, actually. But after conducting the research and having your results, you know something, but you know something maybe about a very small aspect of society, and that is quite contextual. So communicate that in very confident ways. We have policymakers who perhaps do not have all the research that we have or the science that we have, but are really confident in the policies that we are making. And we have robust science, so we don't have any excuse. We need to be confident in what we found, and we need to communicate it as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Salom. On that very passionate note, I really want to appreciate everyone who's been part of today's webinar. There's been many comments in the chat about how insightful it has been. So I want to thank all the speakers for making the time to stay for this 3-hour webinar and sharing their knowledge. We really want to appreciate you. Thank you to everyone who stayed on for the 3 hours, and I hope you've learned something. We'll be sharing a survey with you and together with the video so that you can also share it with other people. So with that, we want to close this webinar, and I want to thank everyone very much for making this happen. To AgriFoSe and SIANI, thank you very much, and I'm wishing everyone a good day or a good evening from wherever you're joining us from. Thank you and bye-bye.